Hello, today I'm going to be talking about language development and dynamic change, and it will be an MCF account, that is, the modular cognition framework will form the basis for anything I have to say. Let's move on and have a look at what I'm going to talk about. Right, first a brief introduction, particularly for those people who are less familiar with the modular cognition framework. And then I'm going to introduce the most general part of the talk, which is about the mind, and it's about the mind as a network. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about what I call, and that is John Truscott and I call, internal context. And this was the topic of our most recent book, which came out in 2019. And then I'm going to narrow the focus down specifically to language, that is the role of language, how language is embedded in the mind network, and then we'll move on to dynamic change. And finally, I'll close with some comments, as I said, about language attrition. Okay. Well, the brief introduction simply is to describe what the modular cognition framework is. What is its basis? Its basis is an integration of contemporary trends in cognitive science research, right? And what its aim is, specifically, is to provide a model of the mind, one that is plausible, given contemporary trends in scientific research, which is up to date because it's kept up to date, and what it does is provide a big picture, as it were, of how the mind is, and particularly it comprises its basic architecture, a set of general and function-specific principles, which I will go into, which enable a representation, so-called cognitive representations, how we represent the outer world, for example, to be constructed, built, developed through the lifetime, and to be managed online during online processing. And who is it for? Well, it's for any person working in the area of cognition, and John Truscott and I began by looking specifically at language cognition because that is our particular interest. But it is about the mind in general. So, talking about the mind in general, how can we characterize the mind? Well, it is a network indeed, but we can also characterize it, if you like, as the brain's software. And when you say software, of course, it immediately evokes analogies with computers that we know and love, or know and hate. But we have to say very quickly that the brain software is not designed by anyone. There's no programmer. As such, it is an evolved software. It is, or should I say, it's an evolving software. We hope that the brain is evolving, and we hope that the brain software, which is the mind, is evolving with it, because we are by no means a species that could be called perfect, and I think everyone agrees with that. So, to give you a kind of introduction, what we have here is something which looks like a fairly simple map of a metro system, and that's quite deliberate because I found that this is a nice way of presenting the mind as a network. And as you see, it has two lines or two rings, a blue ring on the outside and a red ring on the inside. And the blue ring contains 5 systems which, broadly speaking, reflect the 5 senses, and it's the closest our mind has with the outside world. The outside world comes to us as streams of raw data, right? Streams of sound waves and sensations and all kinds of physical data, information, which is only information to us once we have processed it. And the first stage in processing is to stage it on one of these stations on the outer ring. As you see, there's one which specifically processes taste sensations and creates representations of the patterns it is which arrives, as it were, through its front door, and those representations are then stored. So every system has a store, and in those store are the representations that are created during our lifetime. And of course, as we go through life, it tends to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the same goes for all the other systems. Let's take the one on the lower left, the hearing sense. Right, sound waves come into the system. When they eventually arrive at the entrance gates of the auditory system automatically tries to make sense of them, tries to develop a representation of these patterns if it hasn't already. If it has already, then the representation will be activated. But if it's a new sensation, if it's a new hearing sensation, then it will create a representation for that hearing sensation, and it will store it. And that storage contains already quite a few, perhaps, of these representations, which together make up the soundscape of that particular individual. You can think of those representations sitting in the store as memories. That is one way of looking at them, but I shall generally call them representations for most of the time anyway. Then we turn to the red ring, the inner ring, which represents a deeper level of processing and is much further away, if you like, from all those physical signals that are impacting on our five senses. And it's the red ring, we're something that we are born with, and it allows us to, for example, associate meanings with those representations on the blue ring. So go back to our hearing store. That representation of a pattern of sound waves that we were talking about, that will be a representation sitting in the store of that blue station on the outer ring, and that will not have any meaning, it will not have any value, it'll be totally unvalued and nothing will be associated with it. It will be just that, it will just be, as it were, a representation of some sound. To get meanings, to get all sorts of extra things, it needs the red ring to be able to enrich what that particular hearing memory or hearing pattern or hearing representation is. So in other words, there has to be an association between the hearing representation that we've been talking about on the one hand and some kind of meaning, which is the job of the meaning or conceptual system. That's why it has a C on it. It's a conceptual system. That conceptual system has a specific function of creating meanings, abstract meanings, and then once there's an association between these two, then the result is we have a meaningful hearing representation. More of that later. Moving on, I want to point out that this is a fixed architecture. So we go through life with this architecture as human beings, and it's not so very different for, let's say, other primates. There are differences, there are quite a few differences, but in general we might say you would expect a chimpanzee, for example, to have the same set, except for language. Otherwise it will look fairly similar, and what's inside those particular stations will also be different, because different species have different hearing senses, different taste senses. All of the senses are different, and that will impact upon the kind of representations that they're able to produce. A dog, for example, has an extremely sophisticated smell ability, and therefore, of course, the representations in its smell store, if you like, its olfactory store, will be much more sophisticated than the sorts of ones you will find in humans. But anyway, the main point here is it's a fixed architecture. You can't add a system, you can't take a system away. It's absolutely fixed, right? And not only is what you see fixed, also what you don't see, which is the connections between the various systems. This is what we call interfaces. And these interfaces are like pathways which stretch between one particular station and another, or between one station and several others. And these allow associations to be made, the sort that I was just talking about. And that also is fixed. These pathways or these interfaces between systems form their own fixed network, and these can't change. You can't create a new pathway. So this, of course, raises the question, which I'm going to get onto, about dynamic change, is how can a fixed network of systems and connecting interfaces possibly account for the fluid, complex, dynamic nature of our reality? And there are certain people who think it is quite impossible, and I'm going to prove them wrong. Now let's move on to that network of interfaces I was just talking about, right? So individual systems are connected in many ways, and two notable examples I'm going to talk about now, which we can call interface hubs, because they have many connections. Not all systems have many connections, but these two particular systems that I'm about to talk about which I'm about to talk, they are definitely hubs with lots of radiating spokes, as we shall see. And these highly active centres form a sort of crossroads through which many connections pass. This I'm going to show you in a second. Notice that there are similar ones in the brain, and recent research has highlighted this fact. There's particular brain-based publication which shows that there is a semantic system in the brain, and it looks very much like a hub with radiating spokes. But the moment you talk about the hardware, you need very different descriptions, you need different explanations, and a different methodology. So even though very nicely for us there is a parallel type of network, or parallel type of networks in the brain and in the mind, we don't talk about them in the same language. Okay, but we're talking about the software and not the hardware. And my first hub I want to talk about is the conceptual hub. This is the meaning hub, and it's a hub because it has many connections. It's multiply connected with other systems, as I'm about to show, which means that it can make many systems, many things meaningful. The way I illustrated with the example of the sound, a particular sound representation acquired a meaning because there happens to be an interface between that auditory system on the bottom left of the blue ring and the conceptual ring, which is on the left side of the red ring. So here are all the interfaces. Remember, they're fixed, and they allow direct associations between anything that is connected via an interface with the C in the middle, the conceptual system. So that is a good example of one of the ways in which our mind is multiply interconnected, even though each particular system, as it were, has its own rules for building representations. You can connect the representations up thanks to these interfaces. And the second hub is the affective hub, and the affective hub is usually associated with the emotions, or at least the basic emotions like joy and disgust and fear. And these basic emotions can be put into two basic categories, and that is ones which are positive and ones which are negative. And we take this to mean that a given emotion like joy, if you like, which is a positive emotion, must be a complex already a complex representation. It's not just a sort of atomistic one. It's not a single solid, as it were, an undecomposable representation. It's a complex one. Since we're not into affective science to that extent, we don't have any particular ideas about how an emotion would be built up of smaller parts, but one of those parts has to be a value, and that's the positive value in this case. So each of them either have a positive or a negative value, and this positive value and the negative value are representations in their own right, and they come ready-made. We don't have to acquire them, right? But what we do have to do, in many cases at least, is to make connections between either a positive or negative value and a particular representation elsewhere in the system. Okay, so in other words, this affective system is a hub. It's a thing that makes things, many things, valued either positively or negatively. And as we shall see, this will have a very important role in processing. Right, so interfaces like these enable the formation of schemas. So what is a schema? A schema is simply a set of connections, a set of associations that we make during our lifetime, and we're going on doing this all the time, either making a new one or modifying one that we've already made. So you can say that these schemas associate and then co-activate representations in different stores using available interfaces. What I showed you earlier was a very, very minimal schema, that is one between sound and meaning, a sound representation and a meaning representation, making the particular sound representation meaningful, as it were. And once that is made, then whenever you hear the sound, it will activate not just the sound representation, but the one with which it is associated, namely the meaning associated. So if you like, that is a sort of schema in the sense that it is a connection between a particular interface between two representations which are built up according to different principles, but are associated together, and after that are co-activated together. You co-activate one, you will co-activate you will activate the other. So activating one will activate the other. That's co-activation. But most schemas, in fact I think pretty much all schemas, are much more complicated than that. They involve many more connections than the ones I just showed you, the two. Okay, well there is both the affective hub and the conceptual hub together, and that together already shows you how interconnected our mind is. But there are more interfaces to add, and I won't do that because it'll get too complicated. So yes, so what we have there is a fixed network, but a highly interconnected mind. Now, I've mentioned in passing that every particular station on our metro lines, that is to say, every particular cognitive system has a special function, and it builds representations according to its own particular unique principles, right? But of course, apart from these special principles which apply to each of the particular stations on our metro line, or indeed our cognitive systems, another way of putting it. Apart from that, there are general principles, and I'll mention at least two of them as I go along. This is the first one. No cognitive representation is ever activated alone, right? We've sort of seen that already. I've implied it by saying that they're always schemas, and they're usually much more complicated than just associating two things, two different representations. So no cognitive representation is ever activated alone. And whatever the current set of activated representations are, if we're looking at one particular one because we happen to be interested in it for our research, then all the other ones form what is called its internal context. This was part of the title of our book on bilingual processing that came out in 2019. I won't mention that again. Associations, that's to say co-activated representations, include both associations formed in the way I've just described, in the form of schemas, that is to say connecting representations in different systems in those two rings. For example, the syntactic representation, which is on the inner ring, and the conceptual one, which is also on the inner ring. The one you see just to the left is actually a three-way set of connections. So you've got a triangle there. And as I said, most schemas are much more complicated than that. So when one representation is activated, it will activate any representation that happens to be participating in a schema with it. And in addition, in one particular system that we're talking about, there will be other associations which have accumulated within the same store, in other words, built according to the same principles, resulting in an ever more complex representation. So you might have a little representation, let's say a box or a tree, but in the that will be acquired anyway with a whole lot of other associations in the context it's acquired. So it'll already be quickly associated with other things. There will be a schema right at the beginning of the acquisition process, but of course over the lifetime it will acquire yet more representations in the same store, and we're going to see a concrete example of that in a minute. So representations are therefore acquired and activated with their own internal contexts, and it's vital to take this into account when focusing on a particular isolated representation. So if you're a linguist, you might be interested in a particular linguistic structure which is being acquired, which is being used, or which is no longer being acquired for some reason, or a conceptual structure. All of these will come with their own baggage, as it were. And this baggage is called their internal context. And notice that all context is internal. So where does internal context from? Let's just sum up. One, it either derives somehow from the outside world, using the systems on the outer ring. So you will have associations with the stores existing in the systems on the outer ring, and you will also have ones on the inner ring. We just saw that the syntax and conceptual ones are associated with one another. But so all in all, whatever the internal context is, they can come from either the blue ring or the red ring. They can either be externally derived, so originally from some experience in the outside world, from the inner system of the red ring. So, in other words, all context is internally created. This is difficult for us because it's very convenient for us when we look around. I look around this room, for example. You look around the room in which you happen to be, and you see things that are out there, and how they are represented to you appears also to be out there, right? So even the colours you see are not out there; they are created in your head. All you get from the outside are sound waves and light waves, but you make the colours, and you make the colours because you have a visual system which is constructed in a particular way. Not every member of the species on this planet sees the world in the same way. If you're a cat or a dog, you probably only see a sort of bluish yellowish world, right? Perhaps another colour is involved with dogs, but for them, you know, as far as they can see, they see a yellow, a bluish world outside, we see a much more sophisticated version of that with lots of colours, and that's because of something inside us, not because it happens to be outside. We create it. Here are some external examples from the basic contextualized meaning of the fruit orange. Now, I'm going to play a little trick now, and which, you know, a little sort of we will share this illusion. For convenience, we will think of an orange, the basic meaning of orange, as somehow a single representation, and I'm going to treat it like that. And of course I know that even the basic meaning of orange is an assembly of features which go to make up an orange, so it is in fact a complex representation. But for the time being we're going to treat it as a single representation, right, for the purposes of this illustration. And here are some and the meaning of course is in the conceptual system on the inner ring. Here are some examples of externally derived context. For example, there will be taste representations associated with oranges. There will be smell representations associated with orange, and you may get more of these as you go through life. And there will be visual representations associated with oranges. Not all oranges are the same colour. So that will be included as you have your continuing experience with oranges. And of course there are touch sensations from the somatosensory sense. There are touch representations associated with oranges, not only touching via your hands but also touching in your mouth. Now if we move on to internally derived context, let's just take those two hubs I was talking about. Let's take the conceptual system. Within the conceptual system, apart from this basic meaning of orange that we're talking about, there will be other conceptual representations which accumulate to it, making it much more of a complex representation than it already is. There will be persons associated perhaps with oranges. There will certainly be places, events, experiences of various kinds, all associated, and they will all have a meaning, and that meaning will be part of the internal context, internal context of orange. So, and of course there will also be positive or negative emotions, and indeed just basically positive, negative values associated with oranges. Some people might not like oranges, some people might like them, but there might be at least a sort of a value associated with an orange, and that would come from the affective system. Okay, so here we are. What we've put down here is a combined internal context for the representation CS orange. That means conceptual structure orange. Right, let's now put those representations in the stores of these various systems, and I've put all the extra ones I've just talked about of the conceptual system, which cluster around the orange basic meaning. And let's just show the interfaces which allow these to be connected up, and then that's the effect one. So this here, what you see in front of you, is a sample orange schema, right? The moment the basic meaning of orange is triggered, is activated, then there will be, to a greater or lesser extent, activation in all these other systems with those representations to which it has been associated, which are, as it were, participants in this particular schema that we're looking at on the screen. Okay, so that's the end of sort of the mind in general, and now let's look more specifically at language. Okay, we'll go back to our metro system here, the mind's software, so the brain's software, and now using available interfaces we'll build up a sample language schema, right? Okay, so what we have to do is to associate or connect up different specific representations in the stores of specific systems, right? Let's put all those systems involved. Let's put the actual representations in them. You just come in, And let's try and build this schema up stage by stage, shall we, until we get a complete, what we might call a complete schema, a language schema. Okay, so we haven't yet touched on language. What we've got so far is a connection between three different representations, between our conceptual meaning, whatever that meaning happens to be, we don't yet know, but we do know it's a taste, it's a meaning of a taste, and we know that that taste is valued, has a value on it, right, and the value happens to be negative in this case. So we might say it's a nasty taste meaning, but we don't quite know what the meaning is until we get some more schemas, participants involved. So now we've got a linguistic structure, and what it turns out to be is an adjective in the syntactic system, and in the phonological system, that's the speech structure below it, there is a particular phonological structure. This actually is the basis of a particular word, right? But we don't know what language the word is yet. But what we do know is that we've got some kind of way of expressing it, at least internally in our thoughts. Whenever that taste is thought about, then a syntactic structure and a phonological structure come to mind. However, it would be nice if it wasn't strictly a matter of our own thinking. We would like to be able to understand this word, which is in the phonological structure, this word. We'd like to really understand it if it was actually spoken to us by someone else. But for that, we need a sound, right? We need a sound connection. We need an auditory representation. And then whatever the language is that you happen to be able to understand, we can hear and comprehend either or all of the following. We can hear bitter, which is the English phonological structure sound connection. We can hear amer or amargo or kude or nigai. Apologies for pronunciation, of course. And now we are able to understand this. So whenever that particular sound hits our ears and the particular auditory structure is activated, then it will immediately, in parallel, activate all the others, and immediately we'll understand what the person is talking about, which is encapsulated in that schema in yellow that you see in front of you. But of course, hearing something is all very well, but we would also like to communicate it with someone else, and to do that we need to be able to articulate it, and for that we need a few more connections, right? And without going into much detail, perhaps the most important one is a motor representation, a little program for activating those parts of our physical body which enable us to produce what is necessary to communicate bitter, amer, amargo, or kude, or nigai to someone else, right? So now we're in a position where we can actually say it out loud. Of course, we can't write it, and we can't understand someone if we have a sign language. We can't, at the moment, we are not able to interpret anything that comes to us via the visual mode, but we can if we have a connection between the phonological structure and the visual representations, which are relevant to whatever it is, understanding text or understanding a signing. So there we have specifically language schema, and a language schema including what you need either to comprehend the bitter taste meaning, or to express it in yourself by speaking or signing. So once connected and associated, activation of any participating representation in the schema will automatically spread instantly to all the others. It's a sort of parallel activation. And all of this, of course, goes on without you being aware of all these mechanisms, because it's all in the subconscious. So if any representation has a value associated with it, and this is another, remember I said there's some specific thing about the affective system which is relevant to how things are processed, and when things are processed they're activated, and activation is a matter of degree, right? Not everything is activated to the same extent, because at a particular moment some particular representation will not be important, or because it's something newly acquired and you haven't quite got the language aspects of it well established. But in any case, every representation will have its own activation history. But since here we have a negative value, remember it was a taste connected with a negative value, so it was, and now we know it's a bitter taste, so this particular individual is not happy with a bitter taste, so that it has a negative value. But whether it's negative or positive, it has an effective value association, and this will have the effect of boosting all the other ones. So the activation that you see blinking here between the two will actually spread instantly to all the others. So spreading activation boosts the whole schema, gives an extra boost, what we call effective boosting. And how that's useful I will be able to tell you fairly quickly after this. But in any case, each individual representation, we have to remember this, it has its own activation history, and based on that it has its own activation level, so even without this extra boost they will all be activated to different degrees, and this will vary with different contexts. But in addition, because it has a value associated with it, it will get a boost. And if it's a very strong value, if it's strongly activated, a strong emotion or a strong value, then it will get a particularly big boost, right? That, if you're interested in language teaching, you might consider that has implications for motivation. Okay, moving on to dynamic growth. Now, first I have to give you a little review of some basic mechanisms that I've been talking about, but in slightly more detail. What you have in front of you there is a store, right? This is a store, the store of the syntax system, and what you have there, those little blue circles are simply representations, syntactic representations. They're sitting in a syntax store, and they're below that white line, that dotted line, and that's supposed to indicate they are inactive, they are dormant, right? This is a situation you will hardly ever see, because it is understood also in terms of the brain that the brain and the mind are in a state of more or less permanent activation. It's just sometimes they're just jumping up and down quietly by themselves, and sometimes they rise up and do things for us, or try to solve tasks for us. But okay, we'll have to skate over that. I just wanted to present you this as a way of introduction. Each system has its own processing principles, as you know. So the conceptual system builds meanings according to semantic principles, or conceptual principles. There is no central processor. There is no. Everything is functionally specific in this modular system, but one general principle. I remember I told you no activation is ever activated alone. There's another general principle, is that all these various systems try to build a sort of stable, coherent representation wherever it can. So there's a general law, if you like, of processing that means every processor of every system will try and build some kind of coherent representation from its own input. Of course, according to its own code, conceptual code, syntactic code, whatever. It will try to do this. It will try to find a coherent sense, if you like, from its input. Since this is a syntax store, it will have a input which is coming in from whatever happens to be connected with it via the available interfaces that the syntactic store happens to have. which there are only two in this case. And working memory, which is a very common concept, but is understood in different ways, but a very dominant way of understanding working memory in psychology today is that it simply means any representation that happens to be activated, and in the MCF it means anything that happens to be activated in a particular store. Okay, so working memory is whatever is currently activated in its store. Anything that rises up, as it were, is no longer inactive and sleeping soundly. It's called upon to solve some particular task, in this case a syntactic task, and you could also think of the current repertoire of representations in their dormant state as the long-term memory. In this case it's the long-term syntactic long-term memory. Okay, so it's all the bits that came along, at birth, and all the combinations that made over the lifetime, depending on the individual's particular experience in terms of, in this case, language. So with every language you build different schemas to make coherent sense of what you're listening to or what you're reading. And the input in the case of syntax will either be meanings, or it'll either be phonological input, or both at the same time. And as this goes on, as you're listening to people talking, or you're trying to develop a message in order to communicate, this area where the question mark is will be the area of working memory, where things are busily, where the processor, the syntactic processor, is trying to make sense of whatever's coming to it, trying to assemble some kind of structure as it goes along. And it's all talking really in microseconds, so we're trying to slow down processing in order to work out what exactly is happening, right? And nothing stays the same. Schemas and representations are continually experiencing adjustments, however minimal, to their resting levels as a result of this continual online processing. So even if there are the same combinations, nothing new is combined, no new structures are required. Even if that's the case, there will be continual adjustments to their resting levels because of this online processing. The more anything is activated, the higher its resting level will be, and you'll notice that even representations are resting at different levels. So, for example, if you acquire something, if you're, let's say, learning a language, and you acquire something, the representations involved, if they haven't been used for the other language, they will be relatively low, right? So when they're activated, they will rise up. They'll be somewhat handicapped, whereas something you use all the time will be resting at a high level because it's been frequently activated in the past and it's risen up and up and up, and whenever it's activated it will rise up much further to a higher level, and in a minute I'll just show you why that's relevant, right? So here we have an example of some of those blue sleepy representations there now have been called upon to solve a particular task, and they have been activated, and they're now in syntactic working memory, right? And they've been activated to different degrees for the reason I've just told you. So there are some at the top which are intensely activated. I'm using the metaphor of height here, and some which sort of grudgingly appeared just above the white line. These are ones which haven't been activated very much in the past, so they got a rather low resting level, and therefore they got a rather low activation level. And here is the processor. It's grabbed hold of some of these representations, and it's tried to make coherent sense of them by building a bigger structure, a longer representation, a more complex representation for all the input that's coming in, and some of the contents has been used. Notice that not all of the contents has been used. So much more gets activated. There will be arrivals, candidates as it were, and some of these will be winners and some of these will be losers. And in general, in principle, the more highly activated representations will be chosen to assemble in a larger coherent representation. So it's pretty much the law of the jungle. Now, non-participate, we're going to a next stage in our microsecond by microsecond story here. Non-participating representations, ones that were not chosen for the task in hand, which perhaps because they were not so accessible or available to the processor, they have already started falling back to their resting state. But another general rule is activation always means you get some sort of gain while in resting level. So they return to a different resting level from whence they came, and it will be slightly elevated, or very, very slightly. And finally, those things which were used, which one assumes were stayed active for a little longer, they also return to their resting state. Right. So in all cases, activation leads to a gain in the resting level, but I suspect somewhat more elevated for those which are very slightly longer, whose activation period has been a little prolonged because they were involved in the processing of a task. So that gives you a general impression of the general life of a particular store. This is happening all around the system with the different stores. Right. Now let's look at the case of the multilingual, and I'm going to show you how this works, including what I just told you about the boosting effect of values, right, to show you. So here's an orange schema. I've had to considerably inflate the conceptual system in order to get the things in it that I want to talk about. And I've chosen a bilingual who has L1 English and L2 Hausa. Hausa is a language spoken in northern Nigeria and Niger, but is used more generally over West Africa as a lingua franca, and it's the third most frequently spoken language, African language on the continent. I happen to have been apparently a Hausa English bilingual or English Hausa bilingual at the age of 4. So I naturally chose these two, just to remind myself that once I was a Hausa speaker. Let's take our Hausa English bilingual. Now, this original orange idea, the basic meaning of orange, remember, we would like to add 3 associations within the conceptual store that have accumulated to it. One is a language, right? A particular language. The moment you start using a language, then the meaning has an association with a particular linguistic structure spread across syntax and phonology in this case, and that will be language, and it will usually have some sort of name. You will understand it's in this case, I mean, I'm not sure how much I understood about different languages when I was 4, but I would have had the notion that some people speak it and some people don't. And there will be many other associations with Hausa which I'm not representing here, but the Hausa will have its own set of associations: Hausa food, Hausa language, Hausa sound, Hausa music, etc. And the same, of course, for English. So here, basically, in fairly simple terms, I have a set of associations within the conceptual system of other meanings: the English meaning, the Hausa meaning, and the language meaning, different conceptual structures. Okay, and now that's the schema there. Let's have a look at the co-activated bilingual schema, because of course, as we now know, or most of us are fairly agreed upon the fact that when one language is activated, one language system is activated, the other language is activated as well. This is more and more the case. It's more and more established in the bilingual processing literature. It's very difficult to prove that bilingual that one language is completely dormant or completely suppressed because it happens to be irrelevant. Our mind is so interconnected that both languages, in this case the house, anything associated with house, a Hausa schema will be activated along with English schema, and together they form what you might call a co-activated bilingual scheme. Part of this will be a syntactic representation. We looked at the syntax last time. We saw an adjective. Now we got a noun, right? A noun or a noun phrase, whatever your theory happens to be. You'll express this differently, and we have two alternative phonological structures which are activated. One is lemu, which is Hausa for orange, and you won't be surprised that happens also to be the word for lemon as well. So they use the same word lemu for both, and you have the phonological structure orange for English, right? And these of course are linked with various sounds and visual representations that we won't go into here. Right, so you've got a syntactic structure, you've got which is shared. So notice the noun will always be in very, very strong. It'll very high activation level, high resting level, because whatever the language is, there will always be a noun. So that will be a very, very strong, intensely activated representation because it's frequently used. Less so, of course, for these two rival candidates in the phonological store. And now we've talked about what's in the conceptual system here. And the question is, if everything is activated, how is it that one will tend to dominate in than the other? So we either are understanding Hausa being spoken to us or English being spoken to us, and we are either speaking Hausa or we're speaking English. So you might be in a situation where Hausa is being talked about between bilinguals, but they're sitting there in somewhere in Hausa land. They're talking about very specific Hausa things, like maybe Hausa food or Hausa language or Hausa music or whatever. It couldn't be have a topic more Hausa oriented, but nevertheless, as we know, English is perversely activated at the same time. So why don't we get everything mixed up? Well, one reason is, or the most obvious reason is that at the particular moment we're talking about, Hausa is the valued system, and the Hausa schema is the valued system, and that is represented by a value between Hausa and you could also say language, but Hausa specifically between the affective system and Hausa, and of course, as you know, it will spread to all the others. So this part of the schema has an extra boost, which ensures that if Hausa is valued at this particular moment in time, you will be chatting away in Hausa. It can change, of course, suddenly. It may be, for example, my favourite example is that someone turns up who is an English speaker, but everyone knows them not to be a Hausa speaker. So immediately they will switch into English. One way or the other, the English part of this bilingual schema will get a stronger boost, and it will be activated, and the dominance relationships will be change. So you can of course switch backwards and forwards, and that's the story about switching. Of course it might happen in the course of the Hausa conversation without anyone walking in. It might simply be that there are some things in English which are particularly easy to express in English, and these bilinguals of course are aware of it, and they might in the middle of their Hausa conversation switch briefly into English, an English word or an English expression, and then switch back to Hausa. So it doesn't require someone to come in. It just means that for at that particular instant the Hausa schema is temporarily outcompeted by the English one. So what's the bottom line? The mind, with its companion brain, continues to process ongoing life experience, and as it does so, not a moment passes before some development has taken place. So, as I said, with activation, changes happen. If nothing else, things which are activated return to a higher resting level, which gives them a more competitive edge in future. Very, very minimal, perhaps, but this competitive edge will change according to how frequently and how regularly they're activated. As each store in each system receives continuing input via the interfaces, its processor is responding by automatically building a coherent best fit response, doing its best. It may fail, it's not. Things break down if not enough information comes through that allows it to build a coherent best fit response, or it hasn't. It doesn't find anything in the moment of processing available to it in the most highly activated bits to form some kind of coherent response. But it does its best automatically and according to its own internal principles. Each system on each ring having its own internal principles. And as I say, at any given moment, in every microsecond, millisecond, the most highly activated representation effectively claiming precedence, right, putting it in a figurative manner. So in general, resting levels fall slowly over time. So the resting levels will always fall slowly, but they will be reinvigorated, of course, every time they get activated, the representations involved. But most notably, this falling aspect is most noticeable when a representation is left unactivated for a longer period of time. And new associations which get created within stores are producing new combinations from what is available to them, to new schemas arise. And there's continual contextual processing which goes on, which leads to continual adjustments. We saw our Hausa English speaker, even in that short moment, there will be minor adjustments to resting levels as a result of one thing being activated longer than another. So modified schemas are continually being created with new outcomes. So really, how, you might ask, can an outside observer really know at any given moment how an individual is about to behave? From the outside, we have no access to what's going on inside their subconscious mind, or the subconscious parts of their mind. So it is essentially not easy to predict in high detail. And now to end up with a few comments about attrition. Language attrition, it used to be called language loss. Attrition loss was deemed to be a little more sort of negative. Attrition isn't exactly positive, but it seems to be more abstract somehow. So when you forget, or when you lose, or when you attrite, as it were, we have to remember during online processing some kind of development is always taking place. And change at a given moment will be minimal, but over an extended period of time you might start to notice change, right? there will be currently activated representations. They get a boost simply by virtue of being activated. Currently activated will get an extra boost if they happen to be associated with a value, very often they are. And the accessibility, which is another way of talking of resting levels of activation, can also call competitiveness, of those representations not currently activated will continue to decline. So the longer a particular representation, a participant in some or many schemas, if that won't get activated, it's not regularly activated over a longer period of time, it will continue to decline. So continual internal changes it could be described as changes in competitiveness. All of these changes will affect the relative competitiveness of representations. The relative competitiveness. And representations associated with a particular language system, they don't attrite en masse. You don't lose a language en masse as a single unit, but only by virtue of the activation history, that is to say, the changing competitiveness of its various participating representations. Remember the noun example. The noun is always going to get activated whatever language you use, so that won't attrite. But that's just one example. Some representations becoming less competitive will have consequences in observable performance. We start to notice behavioural changes as a result of this infrequent, irregular use of a particular set of representations associated with a particular language. And if you look at the language attrition data, these changes should be discoverable, but using the modular cognition framework you have a way of talking about it, and it's a very specific way with quite a lot of detail. So summing up, what then is attrition? It's like acquisition, it's the effect of ongoing changes in competitiveness. And typically, the major source of influence can be attributed to the weakening of elements in a given representation's internal context, not simply to its decline in its own individual competitiveness. Because everything in the brain is fully, is very well interconnected, we can't really talk in terms of a given representation without taking into account its internal competitiveness. And recovering of the supporting context can bring about a regeneration of attrited elements, and perhaps eventually the whole language system. And this brings me back to my favourite example, which is the Dutch women in Australia who had spent many years in Australia, and like good Dutch people, they had immediately given up their Dutch and adopted English, and as a result they had no sense of how to say things or understand things according to their own reports in Dutch. Dutch had, for their as far as they were concerned, their Dutch had simply disappeared, completely forgotten, and vanished into a black hole. Then mysteriously, at the age of 80 or so, in their 80s, they were surprised to find out that their Dutch was coming back. Why would this be so? And I speculate that part of the reason, or a lot of the reason, can be the fact that in old age, and I should know this, memories that were long forgotten suddenly resurface. You remember things that happening that you thought you had lost forever. And of course what this really means in the terms of the MCF is that the internal context for a particular language starts to resurface, and this may have quite an effect on the regeneration of the language itself, because along with the context will become the things that were associated with it, the schemas that were associated with the internal context. So on that positive note about attrition, I will end. Thank you very much. And the end of all my talk is a beginning. There are many more questions to ask, many more things to think about, but today at least I hope I've convinced you that this fixed system can deal extremely well with dynamic change. Thank you very much. That's all for today.